My father faked his death to dodge debts, and now he's back expecting me to fund his new family. I was 12 when my father died. It was the summer after 6th grade, a season that should have been carefree bike rides through the neighborhood, sleepovers with my best friend, movie marathons on 2 hot afternoons. Instead, it became the defining crucible of my childhood, the moment when the life I knew cracked and collapsed. One day I was just a kid who sometimes resented chores and curfews. The next, I was the child of a man who'd supposedly lost his life in a tragic accident no one would talk about in detail. My mother told me the news on a blisteringly hot day in early July. She didn't even look me in the eyes. She stared at a spot just over my shoulder, her voice shaking as she said, "Your father's gone, Aiden." I remember feeling dizzy, like the world had twisted sideways. I was old enough to understand that gone meant not coming back, but I also felt something off in the way she spoke, like she was rushing through a script she hadn't rehearsed. She took me in her arms for a hug, and her chest heaved with sobs that felt too dry. I didn't know what to do or say, so I buried my face in her shoulder and tried to cry with her, but the tears wouldn't come. Part of me simply couldn't fathom a reality where my dad no longer existed. We didn't have a real funeral. My mother said something about him not wanting a big fuss, so we held a quiet memorial service at home a week later. A couple of my dad's old friends came by, looking deeply uncomfortable. One neighbor dropped off a casserole. A folded obituary, poorly printed on cheap paper, sat on our small coffee table. My mother had typed it herself with few details, survived by his wife, Linda, and only child, Aiden. According to the obituary, Dad died in a work-related accident. That was all. No mention of a specific date, no mention of how or where. When I asked for more specifics, my mother got this pinched look on her face and said only that it had been sudden. Then she'd grab my arm and say, "We have to be strong, honey." In the months that followed, I drifted in a fog. People at school whispered that my dad had run off, that maybe he was in trouble with the law. I heard that rumor from a classmate and lashed out, shoving him against the lockers. I was filled with a simmering rage that I couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was because part of me sensed they were right, that something didn't add up. But I'd been given this script, Dad died, we have to move on, and I tried to follow it. My mother was distant, always anxious, constantly jumping whenever the phone rang. She'd sometimes be on long phone calls behind closed doors, her voice low. Other times, I'd see her studying the mail with a frightened intensity. Still, she'd never volunteer explanations, and so my lonely speculation turned into certainty that something was very wrong, something that haunted me at night. We struggled financially. My mother took on 2 jobs, one as a receptionist at a dentist's office, another cleaning houses on weekends. I was old enough to cook basic dinners, to do my own laundry, to figure out how to budget my allowance. I learned to want less, partly out of necessity, partly because it hurt to see my mother flinch every time I asked for money. The house was always too warm in summer because we couldn't afford to crank the AC, too cold in winter because we had to keep the thermostat low. I started working odd jobs, mowing lawns, washing cars, anything to bring in a bit of cash. I resented Dad for leaving us in such a mess, but I also missed him with a desperation that sometimes made me cry in the shower, so no one would hear. By the time I turned 14, I'd mostly stopped asking questions about Dad's death. It was easier that way. My mother seemed to relax a tiny bit whenever I held my tongue. I drifted through my teenage years in a subdued haze. Decent grades, 0 illusions of going to fancy colleges, minimal social life. I'd see other kids with their fathers at sports games or father-daughter dances for my female friends and feel an ache that never quite dulled. But on the rare occasion, I'd think back to random memories that contradicted the official story. Like how my dad used to talk about getting out of this dump someday, or the shady guys in suits who'd occasionally show up at our door, sending my father into a panic. I recalled the nights he'd come home late, reeking of cigarettes, muttering something about bad luck at the tables. I remember once finding a pink slip on the kitchen counter, some official notice threatening legal action for unpaid debts. When I showed it to my mother, she snatched it away, telling me not to snoop. I tried to piece these fragments together, but the puzzle never fully formed. The consistent message was that Dad had died, So let sleeping dogs lie. I left for community college when I was 18, commuting from home because we couldn't afford dorm fees. My mother had found a slightly better paying job as an administrative assistant, so money was tight, but not catastrophic. We rarely talked about Dad anymore, except for the occasional mention of how he'd be proud when I achieved some small milestone. A part of me still suspected the truth was more complicated, but I'd learned to bury that suspicion under the daily grind of homework and part-time jobs. That all changed when I was 20, home from classes on a Thursday afternoon, sorting through the mail on the coffee table while Mom was still at work. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a thick manila envelope with no return address, addressed simply to my mother. Something about its heft made my stomach twist. I flipped it over, saw that it had been sealed with tape. My curiosity got the better of me, so I carefully pried one corner open just enough to peek inside. What I saw was a thick wad of old documents, some official looking, some handwritten letters, and at the top a single photograph, my father's face, alive, healthy, and smiling in front of what looked like a tropical beach. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the envelope. It felt like being punched in the gut. Suddenly, my entire reality splintered. Dad was alive, or had been, at least when that photo was taken. Why the hell would he fake his death? Was that really what happened? Questions slammed into me, wave after wave. My head spun. I shoved the envelope back together as best I could, left it on the table, and paced the living room, trying to breathe. My mother came home about an hour later, looking exhausted as usual, but the moment she saw my face, she knew something was up. Then she spotted the envelope. She froze, color draining from her cheeks. I demanded answers, voice trembling with rage. She sank onto the couch, buried her face in her hands, and told me the truth in halting fragments. Dad had been in deep with loan sharks' gambling debts that climbed into the tens of thousands. The men who came to the door back then weren't just shady, they were dangerous. One day, after yet another threat, Dad proposed a radical plan. He'd fake his death to escape the debts, then eventually send for us when it was safe. Mom said she was horrified by the idea, but Dad insisted it was the only way. Then one morning, he simply disappeared. A few days later, she forged the obituary. He left instructions to keep quiet, promising that once he got settled somewhere far away, he'd reach out. But weeks turned into months, months into years, and all she got were occasional cryptic letters with no return address, each one hinting that he was working on it. Eventually, they stopped coming. Mom said she'd realized he wasn't coming back, but she was already in too deep with the lie claiming he'd died, collecting a small insurance payout. She was terrified of being arrested for fraud or of the loan sharks turning on her, so she stayed silent. I listened, my heart in my throat. The father I'd grieved for, who I'd resented and missed, had orchestrated his own death, abandoned us to deal with the aftermath. My mother's trembling hands told me she was ashamed and scared. Part of me felt pity for her, but a bigger part felt betrayed by both of them. All those years of heartbreak and uncertainty, all the financial struggles, the fatherless birthdays, fatherless graduations, for what? So that Dad could run away from his debts and start a new life? The envelope, as it turned out, was from Dad himself, or at least from someone connected to him. It contained proof of his identity, some old letters he'd apparently asked third party to deliver, long overdue, and a new letter addressed to Mom saying that he was back in the country and wanted to meet. After the initial shock wore off, we read the letter. It was short and annoyingly casual. "Linda, I'm sorry things got complicated, but I'm home now and need to see you in Aden. We have a lot to discuss. Call me." There was a phone number, just like that. The nerve of the man who'd lied to us for 8 years. My mother clutched the letter, tears slipping down her cheeks, whispering that she never wanted to see him again. I, on the other hand, felt an overwhelming rage that made me want to punch something, specifically my father's face. But I also needed answers. Why now, after all this time, and what the hell did he want from us? I called the number. My mother hovered anxiously by my side, pale and shaking. My heart thumped so loudly I could barely hear the ringing. Then a click, and a man's voice said, "Hello." I recognized it immediately. Lower, older, but definitely his. My father. I forced out a single syllable. "Dad." There was a stunned pause. Then a rush of words. Aiden? Is that really you, son? Hearing his voice tore me in half. Part of me flashed back to being a little kid, riding in the passenger seat of his old truck, singing along to the radio. Another part of me remembered the empty seat at my middle school graduation, the humiliating pity from friends who asked about my dead father. My throat tightened. Finally, I spat out, "We got your letter. What do you want?" He tried to sound gentle, coaxing, "We should meet somewhere. There's so much to explain. I've missed you both." I glanced at my mother, who shook her head vigorously, tears in her eyes. I clenched my jaw. "Fine. Tomorrow, there's a diner on Maple Street McMillions, 8 o'clock. Don't be late." I hung up before he could respond. Mom pleaded with me not to go, terrified that he was luring me into some trouble, but I insisted. "I need to confront him," I said, voice trembling. "I need to look him in the eye and ask him why he did this." She had no argument, so she just squeezed my shoulder and told me to be careful. We didn't sleep much that night. I heard her pacing around in the living room at 2 a.m., mumbling to herself. I stayed in my room, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, a storm of conflicting emotions crashing in my chest. The next morning, I arrived at the diner early, stomach in knots. It was a greasy spoon place with neon lights in the window, the kind my dad used to love for cheap breakfasts. I settled into a corner booth near the back. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I stared at the door, my heart lurching every time it swung open. Then at exactly 8, he walked in. He looked older, obviously. His hair was mostly gray and there were lines around his eyes. But the stride, the tilt of his head, those were the same. He scanned the diner, spotted me, and a flicker of nervousness crossed his face. Carefully, he slid into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see his eyes were bloodshot, his skin roughened by too much sun or stress. He tried a tentative smile. "Hey, kiddo." I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but my voice wouldn't come. I just stared, watery-eyed, taking in the ghost of a father who'd turned out to be alive all this time. Eventually, the dam broke. "You selfish bastard," I hissed, voice shaking. "You left us. You let me think you were dead." I saw tears welling in his eyes, too, but he reached across the table trying to grab my hand. I jerked away. He whispered, "I never wanted to leave you. I had no choice. I was in debt. Dangerous people wanted me dead. Faking my death was the only way." I cut him off. "You could have taken Mom and me with you. You could have warned me, told me something. Instead, I lived my whole teenage life believing you were in a grave. Do you have any idea what that's like?" His voice cracked. "It wasn't safe for me. I was dealing with mobsters, loan sharks. These people don't play around. I thought if you and your mother stayed behind, they'd see no reason to hurt you. And I figured once I settled somewhere and paid off the worst of my debts, I'd bring you with me. But things got complicated. I was always on the run. I didn't want that for you." My hands balled into fists under the table. "You left us with nothing," I snarled. "Mom struggled for years. We almost lost the house. I had to work from age 14 just so we could afford groceries. While you were off, what exactly were you doing?" He sighed, glancing away. "I was in South America for a while, then moved to Southeast Asia. Odd jobs, trying to make enough money to stay afloat. I scraped by, but it was never enough to come back safely. The loan sharks never stopped looking for me. I got in deeper than I realized. Then eventually, they moved on. New targets. My trail went cold. By the time I realized it was safe to come back, it'd been years, and I was too ashamed to reach out." Again, I cut him off. "You had 8 years, Dad. 8. You didn't bother to let us know you were alive?" My voice trembled dangerously, but before he could answer, a waitress came over, giving us a polite smile. "Coffee?" she asked. I just nodded numbly. My father also nodded. We sat in silence while she poured coffee. When she left, I glared at him, waiting. He rubbed a hand over his mouth. "I did send letters at first," he mumbled. "I guess maybe they got lost or delayed or your mother didn't share them with you. I don't know. I was in a bad place, Aiden. I was ashamed. I told myself each week that I'd call, but then I'd think, no, not yet. I need to fix my situation first so I don't drag them into this mess." And then 1 week became 1 month became a year, and so on. He looked up, eyes pleading. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't cut it?" I spat, stomach churning. "You realize what you did to us? You broke Mom. She's never been the same. She's scared of everything. She's been working herself to death, and I've had to help keep her afloat. All because you chose to vanish." He pressed his lips together, tears forming in his eyes. I know. I can't ever fix that. I wanted to leave, but some desperate part of me still wanted something more, an explanation, an apology that made sense. I took a shaky breath, forced my voice to steady. So why now? Why come back? Let me guess, you need money. My father flinched. It's not like that, he said weakly, but his eyes flicked away, betraying him. Though I am in a situation, I got married again, Aiden. I have a daughter. We've hit some hard times. My vision blurred with red. You have a new family? I whispered, voice taut with shock. While I spent my teenage years fatherless, you were off starting fresh with some other wife, having more kids? My father looked miserable, but he didn't deny it. I never planned it, but I fell in love and we had a daughter, your half-sister, Lily. She's 5 now. We've been living overseas, but we had to come back to the US for her medical treatments. She has a heart condition and we're strapped for cash. When I realized we might lose everything, I thought, maybe Linda and you could help. We're family after all. I stared, barely able to breathe. My father faked his death, abandoned me and mom, started a new family, and now had the gall to ask for money because his new child needed medical care. Anger radiated through me. We're family? You sure didn't act like it when you vanished, I said, voice thick. Why would we help you now? He leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. Aiden, look, I know it's a big ask, but Lily's innocent. She's just a little girl who needs help. The medical bills are huge, and my business ventures haven't worked out. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. If I don't come up with the money for her surgeries, his voice broke. She could die. My chest clenched. I couldn't stand the idea of a little girl suffering, but I also felt like I was being emotionally blackmailed. He left me to struggle, but now I'm supposed to bail him out? It was insane. The waitress returned, dropping off a plate of toast we hadn't even ordered. Neither of us touched it. She cast us a wary glance and walked away. I demanded details, how much he needed, what the timeline was. He said the surgery would cost tens of thousands of dollars that insurance wouldn't fully cover. He'd tried applying for assistance, charities, everything, but was still short a huge chunk. He thought maybe mom and I had some inheritance from my grandmother, or that we'd done well enough that we could pitch in. My hands shook. We have nothing, I said flatly. We barely scrape by. Whatever you think we have, we don't. He let out a trembling sigh, looking utterly defeated. What about a loan or a second mortgage on the house? I know this sounds crazy, but I'm desperate. Lily's mother, my wife, Teresa, she's losing hope. I don't know where else to turn. And you're my only family, my real family. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Real family? You forfeited that right the day you faked your death. You come waltzing back, expecting us to clean up your mess again while you're out playing house with your new wife and kid. I pushed my coffee cup away. Appetite lost. I wanted to stand up and storm out, but some part of me wavered at the mention of a sick little girl, an innocent child paying for my father's sins. It twisted my gut in knots. Finally, I stood, my knees shaky. I'm not promising anything, I told him, voice cold. I'll talk to mom, but don't you dare get your hopes up, and don't show up at our house unannounced. I'll be in touch if I decide to speak to you again. My father watched me, tears sliding down his cheeks, but he said nothing as I walked out. I spent the drive home replaying the conversation, fists clenched on the steering wheel. By the time I got there, my anger had only grown. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red from crying. I told her everything, sparing no details. She looked horrified and oddly resigned. I guessed he might have another family by now, she murmured, voice hollow. But the audacity to come back and ask us for money. She shook her head, tears dripping. I can't do it, Aiden. We can't. We're barely stable ourselves. I sank into a chair across from her. I know, but there's a little girl in the mix, apparently with a serious heart condition. That's the part that kills me. My mother exhaled shakily. I feel for her, truly. But what can we do? Even if we wanted to help, we don't have that kind of money. I can't go into massive debt for a man who abandoned us. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I had midterms to study for, a shift at my part-time job at the hardware store, bills to help mom pay. But the weight of that conversation lingered. My father texted me a few times, each message a variation on the same theme. Please call. Lily's next appointment is soon. We need to discuss options. I ignored them all. Then he left a voicemail. His voice cracked with desperation. Aiden, I know you have no reason to trust me, but Lily's condition is worsening. If you can't give us the money, maybe you know of a resource or a loan. Something. Please, son. Don't let my mistakes punish an innocent child. I threw my phone across the couch, torn up inside. My mother repeated what she'd said from the start. We can't. Even if we wanted to, we can't. But one night, I heard her crying in her room, whispering something about that poor little girl. Despite everything, Mom was a compassionate person, and the idea of a child suffering because of Dad's reckless decisions broke her. It broke me too. Finally, I decided to at least see Lily, maybe talk to a doctor, confirm her situation was real. Part of me worried Dad might be lying or exaggerating. I texted him, telling him to meet me at the hospital where Lily was supposedly receiving treatment. He replied immediately, relief apparent even through text. Thank you. We'll be there tomorrow afternoon. I didn't tell my mother, not wanting to stress her out more. The next day, I showed up at the pediatric ward, heart pounding. My father was waiting in the hallway, wearing a threadbare jacket and looking exhausted. Standing beside him was a thin woman with long, dark hair, likely in her mid-30s, holding a frail-looking little girl's hand. The little girl had big brown eyes and wore a bright pink hoodie, an IV line attached to the back of her hand. Her cheeks were sunken, and she looked tired, but she still managed a small smile when she saw me. My father introduced them. Aiden, this is Teresa, and Lily. Teresa gave me a wary nod. So you're Aiden, she said quietly. I've heard so much about you. I forced a nod back, my stomach twisting. Then my father bent down to Lily's level. Lily, this is your big brother, he said gently. Lily's eyes lit up, though she seemed shy. She waved, and I managed a stiff wave back. The fact that this child was my half-sister made my head spin. She and Teresa headed to a checkup, leaving me in the hallway with my father. He looked at me gratefully. Thank you for coming. It means a lot. I shrugged, still feeling numb. I just needed to see if this was real. He nodded, leading me to a waiting area. He handed me a folder with medical records, some genuine paperwork about Lily's congenital heart defect, the surgeries she'd already had, the costly follow-up care. I skimmed the pages, my chest constricting at the sums of money needed. It was more than I'd seen in my lifetime, that was certain. Teresa lost her job when Lily's health took a downturn, Dad explained quietly. I've been driving for a delivery company, but it's barely enough to cover rent, let alone medical bills. We've tried applying for state assistance, charities, everything. It's not enough. His voice cracked. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm out of options. I closed the folder, feeling the weight of it all. Look, we're not made of money. We barely get by ourselves, I muttered. Even if we wanted to help, we can't just conjure tens of thousands of dollars. My father raked a hand through his hair, looking pained. Is there any chance of a loan? A fundraiser? Maybe you could co-sign for something? Or let us stay at your place to save on rent? We're drowning, Aiden, and Lily doesn't have much time. A wave of guilt and anger hit me again. He wanted me, us to bail him out. But Lily, before I could respond, Teresa and Lily returned. Lily came right up to me, eyes bright. Mr. Aiden? She said in a timid voice. Are you really my brother? Daddy said you like to read books too. Do you? I swallowed hard, knees going weak. This sweet, innocent child. I nodded. Yeah, I like to read. She looked delighted. Me too. Teresa gave me a small smile, though she looked as torn as I felt. Her next appointment is in a week, she said quietly. We'll need to make a decision about the surgery soon. I left soon after, mind spinning. The second I got home, my mother knew something was up because I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told her about Lily, about the hospital. She sank into a chair, face drawn. She's 5, she whispered. We were still mourning your father when he was out having a new baby. I couldn't miss the heartbreak in her voice, but she also asked, is she really sick? I nodded, describing the medical records. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wet. What do we do? The moral dilemma weighed on us heavily. We despised what my father had done, but a child's life was in the balance. After a sleepless night, Mom and I reached a tentative agreement. We'd do what we could to help Lily, but on our terms. We wouldn't just hand money to Dad. We'd go directly to the hospital, talk to the billing department, see if we could negotiate a payment plan. We'd consider a small fundraiser, maybe ask for help from local charities or even from extended family if we could. But no second mortgage, no incurring life-ruining debt for a man who'd betrayed us, and absolutely no illusions of this making us one big family again. We met with my father and Teresa a few days later at the hospital cafeteria. Lily was in a playroom nearby, supervised by a volunteer. My mother refused even to sit near Dad, positioning herself across from him, arms folded tightly. I laid out the plan. We'll see if we can put together a fundraiser. Maybe talk to some local community organizations. But we're not. I glared at Dad. We're not going bankrupt for you. Any money we raise goes straight to Lily's hospital account, not your pocket. Teresa nodded, tears in her eyes. That's fine, she whispered. We just want Lily to get the care she needs. My father tried to say something, but Mom cut him off coldly. Don't push it, Greg. We'll do this for Lily, not for you. The tension was suffocating. My father swallowed, eyes glistening, and just nodded. Thank you, he managed. Thank you both. Over the next few weeks, Mom and I scrambled, contacting charities, explaining Lily's situation without fully revealing our twisted family saga. I emailed a few local news stations, hoping for a human interest story that might attract donors. Some organizations turned us down. Others offered small grants or told us Lily was on a waiting list. It was exhausting and humiliating. I resented Dad so much for putting us in this position. He tried to help, but mostly just got in the way, lacking the necessary documentation or references because he'd spent years off the grid. Eventually, we cobbled together a modest sum from a combination of small grants, donations from kindly strangers, and a partial fundraiser that a local church organized after hearing about Lily. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start. The hospital agreed to let Lily proceed with a less invasive procedure first, hoping it would stabilize her condition so she could wait for the major surgery until more funds came in. My mother and I visited Lily before that first procedure. She was in surprisingly good spirits for a kid who'd spent too much time in hospitals. She showed me a picture she'd drawn, our family, stick figures labeled Daddy, Mommy, Lily, Aiden. My heart twisted at how naturally she included me, even though we'd only met a few times. We can read books together when I'm better, she said shyly. I was there when she came out of the operation, asleep from anesthesia, tubes and monitors beeping. Dad hovered by her bedside, tears silently streaming down his face. Teresa held Lily's little hand. My mother stood in the corner, stiff-backed, staring at Lily with a mixture of compassion and deep sorrow. For a second, I saw Dad glance at Mom, a pleading expression in his eyes, some attempt at reconnection. But she looked away, her jaw clenched. The procedure was considered a partial success. Lily would still need the major surgery within months, but it bought time. My father's relief was palpable, but he was also anxious, needing the rest of the money soon. We kept trying. By this point, though, donors were tapped out and charities had done what they could. Mom and I were at our limit of how much energy we could devote to this, especially given that we were working full-time jobs. Meanwhile, Dad was pushing me to consider more drastic measures. What about a personal loan? He asked one day, cornering me in the hospital hallway. If you co-sign, I might be able to get enough. I glared at him. I'm not co-signing anything for you, I snapped. I have my own credit to worry about. I'm still in college. If you default, it ruins my future, and I don't trust you not to default. He looked wounded, but I didn't care. This is for Lily, he pleaded, not for me. I turned away. Go ask your new wife's family, I shot back, though I knew from earlier conversations that Teresa's relatives had already done what they could. We were all out of options. The tension between me and Dad reached a fever pitch. One evening, Dad showed up unannounced at our house, ignoring my earlier warning. Mom was at the kitchen table paying bills when the doorbell rang. I answered it, found him standing there, looking desperate. We need to talk, he said. I tried to shove him back, but he pushed past me into the living room. Mom gasped, seeing him. Greg, get out, she said, voice trembling. I can't deal with you here. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. Linda, please, just hear me out. I closed the door, heart pounding. My father spoke quickly, voice shaking. I found a private lender willing to front most of the money for Lily's surgery, but they want collateral. If you sign over the house as collateral. Mom sprang up, furious. Absolutely not. This house is all we have. I've spent 8 years trying to hold on to it. I'm not risking losing it for your sake. Dad implored. Lily's sake, not mine. Please, Linda. We can figure out a payment plan. I'll pay it off, I promise. She gave a mirthless laugh. Oh, your promises. Like the one where you said you'd send for us? Like the one where you said you'd never abandon me and Aiden? No, Greg, get out. He turned to me, eyes pleading. Aiden, you're an adult now. You can talk sense into her. This is our chance to save Lily's life. My voice cracked with emotion. You're asking us to risk homelessness, Dad? You realize that? After everything you've done, you want to gamble our home? His face twisted with shame, but also desperation. I know how it sounds, but she's my daughter, your sister. I can't let her die because of my past mistakes, and I can't do this alone. Mom stepped between us, her voice harsh. You should have thought about that before running off, leaving Aiden fatherless, leaving me to pick up the pieces. Her eyes shone with tears, but her anger was fierce. Don't you dare guilt us into giving up our security. We've lived without you just fine. You're the one who walked away. He opened his mouth to protest, but she jabbed a finger at the door. Leave, Greg, or I'll call the cops. Dad stood there, shaking with anger and despair. Then he slumped, shoulders sagging. Fine, he muttered. He locked eyes with me one last time, tears in them. You're condemning Lily to suffer, he said softly. Remember that. With that, he turned and left. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the tense silence of our living room. Mom sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Days passed, the guilt gnawed at me. My father's parting words about Lily's suffering haunted my dreams. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I owed Dad nothing, that I was already doing more than he deserved. But Lily's sweet face, her shy smile, her fragile body hooked up to monitors, those images wouldn't leave me. Mom worried that I'd do something reckless, like sign over the house without her consent. She made me swear I wouldn't. I promised, though a twisted part of me felt tempted if it meant saving Lily's life. Then, about 3 weeks after Dad's outburst at our home, I got a call from Teresa, first time she ever reached out to me directly. Her voice shook with panic. Aiden, please, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Lily collapsed. We're at the hospital. They say she needs the major surgery sooner than expected. We don't have the money. Greg's gone off trying to get a loan or something, but I can't reach him. She started sobbing. I'm alone here. I don't know what to do. My heart seized. I'll be right there, I said, ignoring the part of me that said this wasn't my problem. Mom was at work, and I didn't have time to contact her, so I just left a note and raced to the hospital. Teresa was in the waiting room, frantic, tear-streaked. Lily was unconscious in intensive care, doctors stabilizing her. We asked to see a financial counselor who basically told us that without a solid payment plan or insurance coverage for the specific procedure, the hospital couldn't proceed. They recommended we transfer Lily to a public hospital across town that might have more flexible billing, but that meant more delays and red tape. Meanwhile, Lily was in critical condition. I felt a surge of fury at the U.S. healthcare system, at my father for creating this situation, at the universe for punishing an innocent child. Teresa clung to me, sobbing. Where's Greg? He said he'd be back hours ago. My father was nowhere to be found, likely off chasing some half-baked loan shark again. I asked the doctors how urgent it was. One shook his head grimly. She needs that operation soon. We can keep her stable for a bit, but not indefinitely. Another said, is there any relative who can provide financial backing? My mind whirled. Suddenly, a reckless idea formed in my head. What if I used my student loans as leverage or tried to gather advanced installments of future grants? No, that was insane and wouldn't nearly cover this. Another thought, try to crowdfund? But that wouldn't be immediate. I felt cornered, petrified, watching Teresa sob while Lily hovered on the edge of crisis. Then, as though conjured by my desperation, my phone buzzed. A text from Dad. Where are you? At hospital. Big news. I found him in the parking lot, pacing by a dingy old car I hadn't seen before. When he spotted me, he rushed over. I did it, he said, breathless. I found a lender. Not great terms, but enough to cover the surgery deposit. They're wiring the money. We can pay the hospital now. Relief and terror battled inside me. Dad, are you sure about this? Who's the lender? He shook his head. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it. Lily's going to be okay. He sprinted inside, me on his heels, searching for the billing department. Teresa ran up, confused but hopeful. Dad produced a confirmation email on his phone showing a significant wire transfer pending. The hospital staff seemed skeptical at first, but eventually confirmed that the deposit was on its way. They prepped Lily for surgery that same night. It felt surreal, watching from the glass window as Lily was wheeled into the operating room. My father stood next to me, tears in his eyes. Teresa paced behind us, trembling. After what felt like an eternity, the surgeon emerged, removing his mask with a weary but triumphant nod. She pulled through, he said. It was touch and go, but the procedure went well. She's in recovery now. We'll keep her under observation. Teresa collapsed in relief. Dad hugged her, sobbing into her hair. I stood off to the side, tears streaking down my face, 1,000 emotions tangling. Lily was safe for now. But at what cost? Mom arrived soon after, worried and anxious. She saw me, saw Dad, saw Teresa, and her expression went from alarm to confusion to cautious relief when I explained Lily had made it through. Mom nodded, pressing a hand over her heart. Thank God, she whispered. She refused to go anywhere near Dad, so she and I just stood in the corner while he and Teresa clung to each other. Later that night, while Lily was asleep in the ICU, Dad pulled me aside in the hallway. He looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, a half smile on his face. Thank you for being here, Aiden, he said. Maybe now we can start fresh, be a real family. I bristled. Don't kid yourself. I only came because Lily is innocent in all this. I'm not playing happy families with you, he sighed. I get that, but once Lily's out of the hospital, maybe we can all get dinner, talk. He trailed off at my glare. Fine, he mumbled. Maybe in time, but I want you to know I'm done running. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me. I stared at him, remembering all the broken promises. We'll see, I muttered. He nodded, resigned. In the following weeks, Lily stabilized. The doctors said she'd need long-term care, but the worst was over. Dad's secret lender money covered the initial costs, but there was more to pay. Dad insisted he'd manage it, and for once, Mom and I backed off. If he wanted to assume that burden, so be it. The tension between him and Mom remained thick, but at least no more drama was forced on us. I visited Lily occasionally, bringing her picture books. She was sweet and bright, calling me big bro and asking a million questions about my life. Each visit chipped away at my armor. I genuinely came to love her in a protective, older sibling way. One afternoon, I arrived to find Dad in the hallway, whispering urgently to a man in a black leather jacket, a man with a scar on his cheek and eyes that screamed trouble. They looked intense. As soon as Dad spotted me, he broke away. The man glared at me before striding off. I approached Dad, feeling a chill. Who was that? I asked. Dad waved a dismissive hand, face pale. Just a contact, nothing to worry about. But I recognized the vibe, Loan Shark. My father was in deep again. I confronted him, furious. Tell me the truth. How did you get the money for Lily's surgery? He tried to dodge. It was a private loan, short term. I'm making payments. I grabbed his arm. That guy looked dangerous. Are you back in the same mess that caused you to fake your death in the first place? Dad winced, refusing eye contact. I didn't have a choice, he muttered. Lily needed that surgery. I'd do anything for her. Rage and despair churned in me. So you made a deal with sharks again, risking everything? You could get yourself killed or endanger Teresa and Lily. He nodded grimly. I know, but Lily's alive, right? That's what matters. I wanted to punch a wall. You never learn, I hissed. You're going to ruin your second family the way you ruined your first. Dad's face twisted in anguish. I'm different now, Aiden, I swear. I'll pay them back. I won't run away. But my father's track record spoke for itself. Over the next few months, Lily recuperated enough to leave the hospital, though she still needed follow-up care. Dad and Teresa moved into a tiny apartment in a rough part of town. I heard rumors that Dad was missing payments, that shady men were visiting him. Meanwhile, I tried to focus on finishing my degree, helping Mom with bills, visiting Lily occasionally. The precarious balance weighed on my mind constantly. Then it all came crashing down in one terrifying evening. Dad texted me, frantic. They took Lily and Teresa. They said they want the money now. I'm scared. Please help. My blood ran cold. I dialed him, voice shaking. He was sobbing, explaining that men from the loan shark cornered Teresa and Lily outside their apartment, forcing them into a car. They threatened to harm them if Dad didn't pay the debt immediately. He was begging me for help to call the police. My worst nightmares flared to life. Yes, call the cops, I said. I'm on my way. I jumped in my car, driving like a maniac to Dad's address. Mom found out from me, insisted on coming too. By the time we arrived, the police were already there, lights flashing in the darkness. Dad was in handcuffs. Apparently the loan shark had pinned some unrelated crime on him, or the cops had found reason to arrest him for fraud. The details were chaotic. Dad was screaming that they had to find Lily and Teresa. The police tried to calm him. Mom rushed forward, demanding to know where Lily was. My father sobbed. They took her. Because of me. I felt sick, imagining a 5-year-old child with a heart condition in the hands of criminals. The police told us they'd do everything they could, that an Amber Alert was being issued. Hours blurred in a haze of panic. Mom and I ended up at the police station, trying to give statements while Dad was grilled in another room. We learned that the men he borrowed from were the same sort of dangerous loan sharks he'd fled years ago, or at least an offshoot of that circle. My father's desperate attempt to save Lily had backfired, plunging him back into their clutches. Now, Lily and Teresa were hostages. Eventually, the cops traced a lead to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. A police raid ensued. Mom and I waited outside, hearts pounding, while officers stormed the place. Shots were fired. Paramedics rushed in. When the dust settled, an officer emerged telling us they'd found Lily and Teresa, shaken but alive. Some of the loan sharks were arrested. Others fled. My father, still in custody, was brought to the scene to confirm IDs. The reunion was messy and heartbreaking, Teresa sobbing, clutching Lily, who was pale and shaking. Mom and I rushed over, but we were kept back by the police lines. Lily spotted me and reached out, tears streaming. Aiden. I tried to go to her, but a cop held me back until they finished taking statements. It was chaos. Eventually, Lily and Teresa were taken to the hospital for a checkup. My father was taken back to the station, likely facing charges. I was allowed a brief moment to hug Lily before they drove off in the ambulance. She clung to me, trembling. I was so scared, she whispered. They said they'd hurt me if Daddy didn't pay. My throat felt raw with fury and sorrow. You're safe now, I murmured, though I wondered how safe she really was with a father like ours. In the aftermath, Dad ended up pleading guilty to some financial crimes, plus the fiasco with the loan sharks. His lawyer claimed extenuating circumstances he was trying to save his child's life. But the courts saw a repeat offender with a history of fraud, remember the fake death, and they sentenced him to a few years in prison, possibly more if other charges stuck. Teresa, traumatized and furious, decided to move back with her family in another state. She accepted my mother's help in arranging a safe relocation, wanting to ensure Lily got the continued medical care she needed, far from Dad's chaos. I visited Dad once in county jail before his transfer to a state facility. I almost didn't go, but part of me needed closure. He looked broken, an old man before his time. We spoke through the plexiglass window, phones pressed to our ears. He tried to apologize, tears in his eyes. I failed everyone, Linda, you, Lily. I never wanted this. I wanted to fix my mistakes, but I just made them worse. I couldn't muster much sympathy. You had 8 years to do right by us, I said quietly. You chose lies and debts. Lily's only 5, and she's already lived through more trauma than most people do in a lifetime. He sobbed. I know, I'm sorry. Then in a small voice he asked, do you hate me? I paused, the weight of everything pressing on my chest. I hate what you did, I said finally, but I can't hate you entirely, because if I did, that would make me the same kind of bitter person who'd run away from problems. I'm trying to move forward, be better, take responsibility for my life. His face crumpled. You're a better man than me, Aiden. I wish I could undo it all. Then the guard tapped him, telling him time was up. We hung up, both crying. I left, heart heavy yet strangely relieved that I'd said my piece. In the weeks that followed, Teresa called me from out of state, letting me know Lily was stable, adjusting to a new hospital. The local community there even set up a small fund for her care. I promised I'd keep in touch, maybe visit someday if they were open to it. Despite the twisted family drama, I'd grown to love that little girl. Teresa said Lily missed me and talked about me often, her big brother. That brought tears to my eyes. She asked me if I'd remain in Lily's life, at least through phone calls or letters. I agreed without hesitation. Mom and I settled back into our routines, though we were both changed by what had happened. She still carried a lot of bitterness toward Dad, but she also felt a sense of release now that the truth was out and he was in prison, no longer a lurking shadow. We sold the house eventually, deciding it was time to move on from the painful memories. I transferred to a bigger university in a neighboring city, commuting from a small apartment that Mom and I shared initially until I could support myself fully. Once Dad was transferred to the state facility, I wrote him a few letters, nothing too personal, just updates about my life, about Lily's progress if I heard from Teresa. He wrote back, describing prison life, apologizing again. He said he was going to attend counseling programs, try to rehabilitate. I didn't expect much, but at least it seemed he was acknowledging his faults for once. Over time, our letters became less frequent. I was busy building a future, determined not to fall into the same cycles that ruined him. Lily grew stronger thanks to continued medical care. Teresa eventually remarried to a kind man who accepted Lily wholeheartedly. She sent me pictures sometimes. Lily smiling at a birthday party, Lily reading a big book, Lily drawing silly pictures of cats. Each photo made my heart swell with protectiveness and regret that I couldn't be there for her day to day. But I was grateful she had a stable home. Occasionally, I'd call them, hearing Lily's excited chatter about her new school, her new friends. She called me Big Bro without fail, and it never ceased to warm me. As for Mom, she found a sense of closure in therapy. She admitted she'd loved Dad deeply once, but his gambling and deceit wore her down. Faking his death was the final betrayal. Knowing he was still alive somewhere had haunted her, but now that she saw him face consequences, she felt validated in her anger. She found peace in small steps, new hobbies, socializing with coworkers, even going on a few dates. I cheered her on, wanting her to reclaim a life that Dad's departure had stolen from her. Years slipped by. I graduated, got a decent job, moved into my own place. The nightmares about Dad's death and reappearance faded. Sometimes I'd get a letter from the prison detailing how Dad was up for parole soon, how he hoped to find honest work if released. He asked if I might be willing to help him once he got out, maybe let him crash on my couch for a while. I never agreed. I wouldn't sabotage him, but I wouldn't sabotage my own well-being either. It was a fine line between compassion and self-preservation, and I erred on the side of protecting myself. I wrote him politely, saying I was sure there were re-entry programs that could assist him, but I couldn't let him back into my space. He wrote back with disappointment, but also understanding, saying he wouldn't push. Eventually, Dad was paroled. He reached out once or twice, but I kept my distance. I'd heard he found a spot in a halfway house, tried to get a job as a mechanic or something similar. He told me in a letter that he planned to stay clean, no gambling, no shady debts. I've learned my lesson, he said. I want to earn your trust someday. I wasn't sure if that was possible. The scars ran deep. As for Lily, she continued to thrive. When she was around 9, she needed another procedure, and Teresa let me know it went smoothly. Lily sent me a handwritten thank you note for helping me get my surgery a long time ago. I cried reading it. She had no idea how fraught that help had been, how her father's choices nearly destroyed everything again. But I was grateful she was healthy, that she had a chance at a normal childhood. I visited her once that summer, staying in a nearby motel for a weekend. We went out for ice cream, visited a local museum. She beamed the whole time, hugging my side whenever possible. It was surreal, my half-sister, born of the father who'd faked his death and left me. Yet she was so full of life and innocence, reminding me that sometimes good things can sprout even from the darkest soil. One evening during that trip, Lily asked quietly, "Do you think Daddy is a bad person?" I hesitated, my throat tight. "He made bad decisions," I said carefully. "But he loved you, Lily. He tried to help you get better, even if he went about it the wrong way." She nodded, brow furrowed. "He writes me letters sometimes," she admitted. "Mom reads them first. She says maybe someday I can see him again. Do you think I should?" I exhaled, heart aching. "That's your choice, kiddo. If you ever do, just remember you have people who love you and will protect you." She smiled, hugging my arm. "Like you?" I kissed her head. Always. And that's how it all turned out. My father came back from the dead expecting me to bail him out of his new mess. In a twisted way, we did help indirectly for the sake of the innocent child he brought into the world. But in the end, his own actions landed him in prison, and the illusions he tried to spin fell apart. He's alive, out on parole, trying to scrape together a life without gambling or fraud, if his letters are to be believed. My mother and I remain cautious, unwilling to open our doors to him again. Lily grows up in another state, cherished by her mother and stepfather, occasionally exchanging messages with me. I love her in a distant, protective way, knowing I can't undo how she came into my life, but also not wanting to lose her. Sometimes I reflect on that day Dad first died, how I lost a father and gained a world of secrets. It shaped me in ways I'm still unraveling, my trust issues, my fear of abandonment, my fierce desire to protect the innocent. But in the end, I learned that no matter how monstrous someone's choices, life can still produce a child who deserves a chance at happiness. And that if you're going to show mercy, do it for the ones who truly need it, not for the ones who demand it out of selfishness. People ask if I've forgiven Dad. I don't have a neat answer. Some days I feel pity for him, a broken man who never conquered his demons. Other days I feel the old anger, the betrayal that robbed me of a normal childhood, but I no longer let that rage define me. I've built a new life. A stable job, an apartment full of books, a small circle of friends, and a sense of moral clarity. Maybe that's the only real victory, refusing to let his deception and recklessness corrupt who I am. As for the question of whether I'm grateful he's alive, that's complicated. I spent years grieving him, then despising him, then wrestling with guilt over Lily. Now he's somewhere in the city, living a humble existence, trying to atone. We don't see each other. We exchange polite letters every few months, updates on Lily or the weather or mundane bits of life. I don't let him too close, but I don't shut him out completely. I guess that's my version of mercy. Or maybe it's just a boundary I set to protect my own sanity. Life goes on. My mother and I sometimes talk about those traumatic years, shaking our heads at how close we came to losing everything, our home, our safety, maybe even our lives if the loan sharks had escalated. We're both older now, a bit wiser, certainly more cautious. We don't dwell on Dad's reappearance, but it's a thread woven through our family history that can't be fully unraveled. When I think about Lily, I feel a pang of sadness that she had to endure so much chaos before she even started school, but I also feel hope that she'll grow up better, safer, loved by people who won't repeat Dad's mistakes. In the end, my father faked his death to dodge debts and then came back expecting me to fund his new family. We refused to sacrifice our lives for him, but we did what we could for Lily, and in a bizarre twist, that was enough to blow the whole situation wide open, leading to Dad's downfall and Lily's rescue. It wasn't the reunion anyone would script, but reality rarely fits tidy narratives. I've learned to live with the messiness, to let go of what I can't fix, and to care for those who deserve it. Sometimes I visit Dad's old fake gravesite, one my mother set up in a small cemetery plot for appearances. There's a simple stone marker with his name. It's a lie carved in granite, a reminder of how easily truth can be buried. I stand there, feeling a mixture of bitterness and strange gratitude that I survived his lies. Then I walk away, stepping back into a life he can't control, forging my own path forward with the lessons his betrayal taught me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that no matter how twisted your family history, you're not doomed to repeat it. You can choose a better way. And that choice is a kind of freedom my father never found, but one I'll guard fiercely for myself and anyone I care about, including the little sister he left behind.